Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Tuttle-Singer from the Times of Israel community, and I'm so excited to tell you about this project we're doing with Shaharit, an Israeli think tank and nonprofit. Now, Israeli politics and society are too often seen through the limited frame of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the religious-secular conflict. Even President Ruvi Rivlin's description of Israel as being made up of four tribes, the Arabs, the religious Zionists, the Haredim, and the secular, is still an incomplete picture. Israeli society is made up of a diverse tapestry of identities, each with distinct worldviews, histories, and narratives. In order to understand Israeli society and politics, and in order to have an impact on what goes on in Israel, and in order to properly communicate about Israel in the diaspora, it really helps to understand these identity groups, the conflicts between them, and what must be done to build bridges. So please join us for this 5-part learning series with leaders and activists from 5 of Israel's major identities that are working towards building new social partnerships across all of Israel's diverse communities. Thank you so much, and now over to our hosts at Shaharit.
Hello everybody, we're very excited to be here. This is the first of a series of events that Times of Israel and Shaharit are organizing together. My name is Gabriel Sod, and I work at Shaharit as the Resource Development Manager. So I want to tell you just briefly what is Shaharit. So we are a mix of a think tank, a leadership incubator, and a community organizing hub. And our goal is to form a new social partnership among all of Israel's communities to build a future rooted in the common good. So today for our conversation, we are joined by Sagit Peretz-Deri and by Seri and Sarah Tuttle-Singer. Both Sagit and are graduates from Shaharit's 120 program, which is one of our main programs. It's a multi-year long initiative that began in 2014. And the goal of the initiative is to build a network of multicultural national political leadership that can help change the fabric of Israeli society and bring us from a place of polarization to a discourse of common good, right? And base, this idea of promoting the common good. So let me start by introducing each of our speakers briefly. So Sagit Peretz-Deri is a speaker and an activist in the areas of Judaism, feminism, Israeli politics, Mizrahi culture, and Sephardic halacha. A real estate lawyer by profession, she works to promote the inclusion of Mizrahi Jews in the religious community in Israel, and she also fights for greater inclusion of women in traditional Jewish frameworks. Sagit was active in the religious Zionist party Beit Yehudi, and she briefly considered running as a member of Ehud Barak's list to the Knesset in the last elections. Is a social changer. She served as the gender policy manager at the Tel-Aviv-Yafo municipality. And today she's a senior advisor on partnerships and civic engagement for the government. And she's also one of the founders of the group Ratzot ve-Mashpiot, Run and Influence, which is a group of women that promotes the inclusion of women in politics. And last but not least, we have Sarah with us from Times of Israel. Sarah is the author of Jerusalem Draw and Quartered, and the new media editor at Times of Israel. She now lives in Israel with her 2 kids, where she climbs roofs, explores cisterns, opens secret doors, and talks to strangers. Sarah has written for a variety of places, including, of course, in Times of Israel, Veller, Time.com, Jewish Journal, Salon, and Ladies Home Journal. And she writes about her life in Israel, her love of Jerusalem, and her family, but she mostly writes about people. So we're very excited to have these 3 amazing women here with us. And today we're going to be talking about Mizrahi Israelis. So for those of you who don't know, Mizrahi Jews are Jews that come from North Africa and the Middle East and arrive in their majority, although some arrived before, but arrive in their majority to Israel as refugees and immigrants after 1948 when the state was formed. And during the first decades, they were largely marginalized and They were actually sent first to transit camps and then to development towns in the periphery of Israel. And they were also forced to adapt the European culture of Israel's founders. However, today, Mizrahi culture can be found everywhere in Israel, and Mizrahi Jews, which are actually today the majority of Jews in Israel, make up one of the most important and fascinating voting blocs in the country. Actually, other than working for Shaharit, I'm also a doctoral candidate in sociology at NYU, when I'm actually researching this topic, Mizrahi political participation. So I'm very excited to speak to both of you about this. So let's start with the questions. So I would like to start by asking the two of you to tell me an experience, or the first experience that you remember where you felt Mizrahi. Was that something that you grew up with, you were born with, that suddenly appeared when you were grown-ups? If you could share us one experience to start, that would be great. Seri, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, hi, thank you for inviting me. It's really exciting being with you, and of course the topic is not only fascinating, but is part of my identity, and a very, very strong and important part of my identity. I think many Mizrahi people will tell you that in some part of their life they had an enlightenment. They found out that there is a Mizrahi issue. I think that it's very similar to what I hear from feminists. Many Mizrahi activists say, you can hear them tell you a story about their life before and after. They had a moment of an enlightenment when they found out their Mizrahi awareness, when they understood what happened to Mizrahi people in Israel. Okay? But I think that I grew up into this family that was very political, very aware of the situation of the Mizrahi Jews in Israel. So I cannot really say that it started in a certain point. I just grew up into it. I remember as a very young child, people around me say, we must show the world, we must show people around us that we are not less than them. We are as good as the Ashkenazi people, okay? This is a goal. I think as a child and as a talented child, I had this burden on my shoulders saying, like, I heard people around me, my family, my entire, the entire people, the entire community that around me saying to me, you are talented, you should get as high as you can, and you should be our, well, we will prove them through our children. Children will be successful enough, will be educated enough to show that we're not less good than other Jews in Israel. We are as good as they, and we can even be better than they. They are the Ashkenazi people. I think that the generation of my parents grew up under the feeling that their religious, their culture is considered to be less good than the culture of the Ashkenazi people. My parents told me a few times that as religious Jews in Israel, they felt that they are ashamed to say, I'm a religious person, I'm an Orthodox Jew, because it was something to be ashamed of. And it is a very, very important part of their identity. But I have many stories, but I think that's the basic. I grew up in a very, very political family who told me, we have a mission here. You should get as high as you can, and you should never forget where you came from, and you should take care of the people around you, the people from your community, and I feel obligated to that.
Was that also your experience, or did you discover that you were Mizrahi in like a different way?
Hi, so thank you for having me as well. I'm always glad to be part of something Shaharit is organizing. For me, it's a home, so thank you for the opportunity. Sagit, it was really interesting to listen to your things. My experience is slightly different, even though there are some things that are similar. So I'll explain. First, my look is very typical. I look very Mizrahi, very Yemenite. My family is of Yemenite origin, and my look is very typical. So for me, it has always been there. I always remember how people, sometimes before they even knew my name, they asked me, "Are you a Yemenite?" And so for me, it was always there. And I think I started to develop awareness when suddenly it wasn't there. And that happened when I was studying abroad. I had a semester as an exchange student during my master degree. I lived there for a few months in the Netherlands. And, it wasn't the first time that I was abroad, of course, but it was for a long period. Being in one place for a long period, it's something that didn't happen before. And suddenly I wasn't a Yemenite, I suddenly was either a Jew or an Israeli or an Arab, an Arab look person that everybody thought that, or many people thought that I was an immigrant or something like that. And suddenly when I didn't have this Mizrahi identity, this Yemenite identity with me, I suddenly noticed that it exists. And I think that's the place. That's when my awareness started to develop. I listened to what Sagit said, and you mentioned the experience of being a talented child, and I was also a talented child. The messages that I received were they were not like be like them or something like that. I was always educated to be like to do the best that I can, and to be as excellent and better than everyone, regardless of their of their origin or their gender or whatever. But being a talented girl makes you look around, and I always looked around. I was really good in math, and I went to university very early, and I went to study like science, computer science and math at the university. And whenever I looked around, I hardly saw any girls. I hardly saw any Mizrahi Jews. And I always felt that I'm kind of alone there, in the sense of I'm the only Mizrahi, I'm the only girl. It's a thing. It makes you think, noticing and realizing that there aren't people like you in the places that you're at. Makes you think a bit and ask yourself questions. Ask where is everybody else? Why am I the only one here? Is it because I'm so talented? No, I don't think so. I think that there must be something that isn't right here. It doesn't make sense that all the girls are like this and I'm different, or all the Mizrahi are one thing and it doesn't make sense. Something is happening, and I think this has helped me to develop my social view and my feminist view, and it made me like have a wider perspective. And that's and all my my agenda, all my social agenda is related. Being a feminist and being a Mizrahi activist, and even being left, having like left stances. It's all related to this, and it all started from this experience of being alone.
Let me ask you a follow-up question about that, because I thought it was very interesting how you transition between like saying, okay, so when I was in Israel, people used to see me as a Yemenite, and suddenly I was abroad and I started thinking of myself as a Mizrahi woman, right? So what do you think actually defines Mizrahi identity, right? Is it cultural characteristics? Is it an approach to religion? Is it a shared history? Like what, in your opinion, defines Mizrahi people, the Mizrahi people?
Sagi, do you want to start or?
That's a question for both of you, yeah.
Okay, so I have something in mind. So obviously Mizrahi is a local definition. It isn't relevant when you're outside of Israel. It's a definition that stems from the Zionist movement, basically, and the European roots of the Zionist movement. So the definition of Mizrahi is it stems from the Ashkenazi essence of the Zionist movement, the European Zionist movement that established the state of Israel. I'm saying it, but because that's the common knowledge about Israel. But obviously, there are the untold stories about the establishment of Israel and the place of Mizrahi Jews and Jews from other places in making the dream come true, the dream of the Israeli state come true. But for our discussion, I refer mostly to the what we call common knowledge and common perspective about the state of Israel and the Zionist movement. So it's a local definition, and when you look carefully into this definition, it's a bit strange because the Zionist movement looked at Jews from Morocco and from Yemen. It put them under the same category of Mizrahi, under the same label. But when you open a map and you look at Yemen and you look at Morocco and you look at Germany, you see that both Yemen and Morocco are closer geographically, are closer to Germany than they close to each other. So it's not even the geographical roots of the definition of Mizrahi is not very, it's a bit strange, I would say. So I think what actually connects Jews, Mizrahi Jews in Israel, is the treatment from the Zionist movement and the stereotypes and the status in the Israeli society that started even before 1948. It started basically when the Jews from Europe arrived at Israel before there was a state of Israel, and at the same time Jews from other places, non-European places, arrived at Israel, if it's Yemen and if it's Morocco and if it's other places. And the like meeting here Jews from so many different places in the world that look the same, that look differently, but still are supposed to be the same because they're Jews. I think these differences, that's what made the category of Ashkenazi, the social category of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. And later on, when the power and privileges were on the Ashkenazi side, it created the gaps, the social gaps, and these are very elusive gaps. So, like the definition of the Mizrahi Jews is a bit elusive, also the social gaps are a bit elusive, and maybe that's something that really characterizes Mizrahi, the definition of Mizrahi, the elusiveness.
Do you think the same, Sagit, or is there anything else then? So she was speaking about how the state, right, and the Zionist state created this category, and that's what actually formed, like it was the basis of the formation of this group. Do you think that after 70 years that the state of Israel exists and that this category exists, has this group developed any other shared characteristics?
Well, I think that if you ask people who are originated from Yemen, for example, they would say, I'm Yemen. If you would ask my grandma, she would say, I'm a Moroccan Jew, or I'm a Sephardi Moroccan Jew. She would not say, I'm a Mizrahi woman, okay? They never heard of it before they came to Israel. I think they never heard of it for a few decades, and they didn't actually know that they are called Mizrahi. I'm a Moroccan Jew. I'm a Yemenite Jew. I'm a Iranian Jew. Okay, as Or said, the cultures, I cannot find much resemblance between Jews from Morocco and the Jews from the Asian parts of USSR, the Soviet Union, who are, when they came to Israel, they were all called, sorry, I see that you cannot hear me. They were all called Mizrahi. They are not similar in anything. But I think that now, after a few decades in Israel, we have some identity issues, if I can call it this way, that are part of all of the Mizrahi, all of the Mizrahi community from all origins. Most of the similarities are because of the same experience of living in Israel as non-Ashkenazi Jews. And I feel that most of the Ashkenazi Jews in Israel, if you would ask them, what is your identity? They will not say, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. They will say, I'm Israeli. And many of the Mizrahi people in Israel, if you would ask them, what is your identity? How you call yourself? How would you describe yourself? They would say, I'm a Moroccan Jew. I'm a Yemenite Jew. They would state their origin.
So, Sarah, do you wanna get into your question?
Yeah. I want to ask you both a question about about religion now, and how many Mizrahim define themselves as Masorti, traditional, not halakhically observant, but observant of some things. It's like the whole, you make kiddush with the family on a Friday night, and then you go to the game kind of thing. And that's actually how I grew up in my American Jewish framework. Israeli Judaism, on the other hand, has been defined more by the Rabbanut as an all-or-nothing halakha Torah observant standard. By contrast, Masoretim offers an interesting model of I'm only partially observant, but I'm good with that. And that challenges the mainstream paradigm of the all-or-nothing Judaism. And I'm curious if you think that this definition could serve as a model for all of Israel, including for the Ashkenazi communities here.
Well, I think the being Masorti, as we usually call it, has a very, I think it has a very, very important suggestion to the Israeli society. It is an option that can make people who came from very different places to sit together, because you are not being judged, but how you are dressed, or how observant you are, whether you go to shul, or do you fast, or do you keep the Shabbat. You are part of the community, and nobody checks out what exactly you're doing. Okay, so on the other hand, as I said before, you should not apologize, not for being too frum, or for not being observant at all. You can be whether a secular person or a religious person, but or maybe something in the middle. Keep some cultural practices of identity, like doing kiddush, or I don't know, having a Seder night in Pesach, but there is no checking list, you don't have to do something in order to be part of the community. So in this aspect, I think the option of being Masorti is a very good option to our society that today is actually being torn apart by differences between different communities in Israel.
What do you think, Ol?
It's really interesting for me because I no longer consider myself as Masorti. I think it's a term that started like it becomes more present in the Israeli public discourse, and I think it's good and it's positive, and I really agree with what Sagit said about the fact that it allows people to, it makes more options, it widens the options as I see it. For me personally, it really helped me to admit with myself, admit like in front of myself and in front of society that I'm secular. So in this sense, I think it made good for me personally. I do think that Mizrahi eventually it means the literal meaning of the word in Hebrew means Eastern. And we live in the Western world, Israel is, eventually it's a Western country, and it was established while looking up to Western countries, obviously first and foremost the United States of America, so I think we live in a very, very Western, there are communities in Israel that are that live their lives and their non-Western life, and it's great. But I think the mainstream in Israel is quite Western. Now, as I said, Mizrahi is Eastern, and I think the Eastern approaches, not only Mizrahi, also Far East, etc. I think they suggest, they offer something. Some non-Western worldview, and I think it's really important. We have a lot to learn from it. I think Western approach is quite dichotomous, and it gives a lot of weight to definitions and to label. And in more Eastern societies, and also in the Mizrahi approach for Judaism, if it's like the Sephardic Jews, the Sephardic, how do you call it, the Sephardic stream or the Sephardic version of Judaism, things are more merging, the limits are less strict. I think being Masorti, the Masorti approach kind of it demonstrates it, because you don't have to have like the strict label and to do certain things and not to do other things. It really allows you to do whatever you want to do without too many definitions. Me personally, I grew up in a house where my father used to go to the synagogue every Saturday night, every Erev Shabbat Eve. And he went to the synagogue where his father used to pray. His father was no longer alive, but still he and his brothers continued to go there every Friday, and they met there. And my father used to go there by car because we lived quite far from there. And for me, it was the most natural thing to do, Daddy is going to the synagogue, he's driving to synagogue in a car. Now, I never thought it was an issue until I was like, a teenager, and I went to a youth movement. And in the youth movement, there were also, religious people. And they asked me if what I am I religious, am I secular? And I said, I live in a Masorti house. My father is is driving the car to the synagogue every Friday, and they were like, "Oh my God, are you reforming? And I was like, "What is this? What are you talking about? What is being a reform?" Really, when I was a teenager, like almost 20 years, more or less 20 years ago, I didn't know what about being reform or being conservative. Things that are really common in the States weren't that common here in Israel in the early 2000s. And I think that's something which is very, very Mizrahi, for Mizrahim or for Masorti, in a Masorti approach. Yeah, you can do it, you can have your kiddush, and then you can drive to the synagogue, you can have the kiddush, you can then go to a club and, go out, take a taxi, whatever. And it's okay, and you don't need to label it, and you don't need to give it a name, and it's definitely okay. In Ashkenazi approach, apparently you might need to create a whole new agenda of being a reform or conservative in order to do it, so it's a bit fun when you think about it.
I want to move into our next section, but I want to let Sarah just respond quickly to what we just heard.
I appreciate the answer, and I grew up in a family where we kept kosher. We did not have separate plates, but we still said we kept kosher, and we didn't eat any trade.
Like my family.
But we went to synagogue every Friday night. But it's Los Angeles. We had to get in a car and we had to drive 20 minutes across the city to get there. And so I relate to so much of what you said. And I for one like that approach. And I don't love labels, but if I'm going to put a label on my own upbringing, I grew up in a Reform synagogue, but we were the religious family in the Reform synagogue that didn't eat treif and that did kiddush, and it was an interesting upbringing, and so much of what you said really resonates with that. And I think for our American audience tuning into the series with Shaharit from the Times of Israel community, they will relate to so much of what you and Sagi both shared in the last few minutes. So thank you.
So far we've talked about Mizrahi identity in terms first of culture and of personal experiences, and after that we spoke about religion. So I would like to turn our conversation into politics. According to data from the Israel National Election Studies, about 70% of Mizrahi Jews supported in the past 10 elections either the Likud party or the right-wing party. So I would like to hear if you feel there's a special link between Mizrahi Jews and the right wing, and if there is one, why so? And I think that it would be interesting, Sagid, to hear from you, because you've actually been very involved in party politics, right? So as a Mizrahi woman who is also involved in a right-wing party and in a center-left party, it would be very interesting to hear your experience in these two worlds.
Well, I was, as I said,
just if you could get a little bit closer to the computer.
As I said before, I grew up in a very political party, so I actually was born into the Mafdal, what was at the time, as it was called at the time, and now it's Habayit Yehudi, or
the Jewish.
Which is, I think that it's the most right-wing party today in Israel, right? So I was actually born into it because my father and my grandfather were both active within the party. However, they were part of the party at the time that religious people who were not Haredi, who were not ultra-Orthodox, were all gathered in the same party. It was more social belonging than a political view. Okay, so if you were national religious Jew in Israel, you were part of Hamafdal, of the. They were also called Mizrahi, but in a different meaning. So I grew up into it. I went to Bnei Akiva. That was our youth movement. I went to what we call Mamlachti Dati. It's the state religious school. And it was my natural habitat. So when I was started to be politically involved, I just joined our city branch of the party. And after 2 years, I think, I found out that, when you experience more and more things within the party, I understood that those people do not like Mizrahi people. So as long as I was talking about feminism, as long as I was talking about changing the status of women within the Orthodox community in Israel, it was fine. But when I started talking about the Mizrahi community in Israel, I became crazy. And at the election of 2015, at the beginning of 2000, I think it was March 2015, the whole issue of Hashever Adati, the difference between Israeli Jews who came from different countries, from different origins, was very on the table. And the reaction within the party was very racist. And I understood that I cannot stay there. I don't share their views about our relationship with the Arabs, with the Palestinians. People who were like my father, who in the past was very for peace agreements, and even giving up lands. If we can get peace, then it's okay. We're not into not sharing the land. It's not a religious thing for us. Then there is no place for people like me in this party anymore. So I left. And but I do think that the Mizrahi people in Israel, well, they vote mostly for the Likud party for many years, but they do it for a few reasons. The first reason is that the left-wing parties are considered the old elites of Israel. And many Mizrahi people still see the old elites as the people who were not good to their parents, the people who put us near the borders, who did not let us go to schools, go to universities. We cannot provide for our families good enough because of how they saw us, because of how they treated us. So the Likud was a place that the Mizrahi people were accepted into. For me, it's not the place today because I see myself as a person who wants equality and peace for everyone in Israel, not only for Jews. But I can totally understand that my position is part of me being, well, how can I put it, a strong woman. I'm not worried about how I'm going to make a living. I'm not worried about what's going to be with me tomorrow. I feel strong enough, my identity is strong enough to say, okay, I can really go out there and say I have something to give. I don't have to protect myself all the time because I'm worried what's going to happen tomorrow, okay? And many Mizrahi people, do not feel this way in Israel because they still feel as a minority with being depressed and not giving the right space for their culture, for their social needs, for their economic needs. But this is just one issue, I think. I think that the issue of nationalism It's very strong not only within the Mizrahi community in Israel, but it is a very, very strong sentiment in the entire Israeli politics. How many people vote for left-wing parties in Israel? Not many, okay? The power of left-wing parties in Israel for the last more than a decade is not very strong, okay? So most of the Ashkenazi also vote for right-wing parties. It's something that we can see all over the world, you know. You can look at the Brexit of Britain, that they don't want to be part of the European Union. In America, people voted for Trump, okay? They could have voted for Hillary, which is liberal and a feminist, and she's a woman, but they didn't. So we see that all over the world. It's something that happens not only in Israel. So I feel that it's a bit unfair as a left, as a person, as a woman who sees herself with left views in the issues of politics and economics and everything. I think it's not fair to go to the group in Israel who is not as strong as the Ashkenazi group and say, you are too nationalist. There is reasons for that. And
what do you think, or why do people tend to think about Mizrahi Jews in that way, right? Like to identify them politically. And what I think it's interesting is that it's not only coming from the left, right? It's not only the left that's saying, you know, Mizrahi people are identified with the right. There's a recent interview by Izraeli Mizrahim, for example. And I know Sarah wanted to talk about Avishai Ben Chaim and his theory about the second Israel, right? So why do you think that from both the left and the right people identify Mizrahi or want to identify Mizrahi Jews with the right wing?
Well, I think Sagit explained very well this, you know, the, how will I say it, like the you know, eventually people vote, people in general, you know, not only Mizrahi, everybody vote emotionally. They sometimes think that they vote, that they're doing like a strategic decision when they go to vote, but eventually people vote to the candidate that will defend their interests. And I think Sagit explained very well why the left wing in Israel doesn't really protect the interests of not only Mizrahi Jews. I would say, you know, the majority of the Israeli society. I'm saying it, and I'm sad to say it. I say it as a leftist, but unfortunately, you know, the population in Israel is going right in the past few decades. At least, you know, when it comes to voting, it votes to right-wing parties, even though the approaches in the public sometimes are more liberal, you know, but still, eventually people vote to right parties, and definitely there is a problem in the left wing in Israel that is not only related to their approach to Mizrahi Jews. I do want to say that I wish, and I think it continues your idea, Sagit. I really wish that one day there will be a research about how Ashkenazi Jews vote and how come that they always vote to generals. You know, they always vote to someone who used to be very senior in the army, etc. I wish one day we'll have this kind of a research, because we tend to talk about how Mizrahi vote, and sometimes, you know, this discourse about how Mizrahi vote, it sometimes implies that they are to blame in the situation, the political situation in Israel. And I think it's unfair, and I wish sometimes the public discourse will be able to see it and try to expand the discourse and talk also about the um, the hidden population that we never talk about in Israel. It's the Ashkenazi Jews, and in the United States and other places in the West, it's the white population, the men population. It's really similar. We always ask what women want and stuff like that. We never talk about men. So I wish we'd start talking about them too. I do want to say one important thing about the left wing in Israel. I think Mizrahi Jews looked left, and they saw how the solidarity, how the left and the Ashkenazi left in Israel has a lot of solidarity to many populations in Israel and outside of Israel, to Arab Jews, to the Arab population in Israel, to Palestinians, to populations, abroad, like refugees, etc. But unfortunately, the solidarity toward Mizrahi Jews was never there. Not only so, I mean, they had a lot of solidarity and empathy to other populations, but when it came to when Mizrahi Jews talked about the injustices towards them and about their pain and etc. So in the better case scenario, it was just ignored. In the worst case scenario, it was denied. So I think that I hope that one day the solidarity in the Israeli population will be much better between all the people, everyone. But we first need to start and look at the solidarity of the Ashkenazi hegemony toward other Jewish groups in the Israeli society.
We're heading towards the end of our conversation. So I want to give first, Sagit, a minute to briefly respond to what Or was saying. And then after that, Sarah and I will ask each of us one last question, and then we will finish the panel. So Sagit.
I think I want to add to what Or just said, and this is very, very important. Or said that, the left-wing parties in Israel and the left communities in Israel have no solidarity with the pain of and the discrimination against the Mizrahi Jews in Israel. One would think that as left groups, you would support groups who were discriminated, right? But what happened in Israel is that the left groups in Israel are basically the children and the grandchildren of the generation who established the state of Israel, the Avodah Party. And they are more interested in protecting the establishment of the first generation in Israel and their parents and the people who were the founding fathers of Israel, than supporting the Mizrahi issue, than supporting the Mizrahi communities in Israel. So in a way, the left-wing parties and communities in Israel would support the Palestinian claims, as you would expect left-wing parties, right, to support communities that you feel that they are oppressed. But on the other hand, they would not support the Mizrahi claim for justice and equality, because they feel that the Mizrahi claim for justice and equality actually threatens their forefathers and the people who established the state of Israel. So they prefer saying, you just imagine that, you know, there is no discrimination against Mizrahi.
So, Sagit, I want to stop you there because that's precisely what Sarah's question will be. So let us ask both questions together, and then we'll wrap up with an answer from both of you. So, Sarah.
Well, Sagit, I'm glad you started talking about this because this is my next question, and my next question is a sensitive one. But I think it's an important one to ask, an important discussion that we need to have, not just for the Shaharit audience, but also for the Times of Israel community audience. So last winter, I rode in a taxi with a driver who was born in Israel, but his mother and father were from Yemen. And he told me a horrific story about his aunt who gave birth to twin girls. Both girls were born pink and healthy and crying, but within hours of being moved to the nursery, the doctors told the mother that one of the baby girls had died. The parents asked to see the body, but the doctor said she was already buried. And 18 years later, the living daughter received her first draft notice from the army, and she showed up to the military base, and she met a young woman who had the exact same face and the exact same birthday, but a completely different last name. The taxi driver told me that his cousin tried to talk to this other woman, but she ran away and told a commanding officer that his cousin was harassing her. And to this day, the family is convinced that this woman was the allegedly dead twin sister. There have been other stories out of Israel that speak to this, of babies born to Mizrahi parents, babies who supposedly died and were buried somewhere, but the parents never saw their bodies or never even saw their graves. And there are rumors that many of these babies were adopted out to Ashkenazi families, particularly Holocaust survivors who were unable to conceive or who had lost children during the Holocaust in Europe. And I know this is a difficult subject. It's painful, it's fraught. I know some Israelis who call this accusation blood libel, and it's been disputed by scholars and refuted by 3 state commissions that examined the matter and concluded that most of the children had in fact died. But the cases kept resurfacing, not least because most of the families were not given children's bodies or informed of their burial places. And also because Israel has a track record of treating non-Ashkenazi communities poorly during the early years of statehood. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about any developments in the case of the missing children, if there are any. And I'd like to hear more about the discrimination that the community has faced in Israel today and how it's been historically, and if it's changing at all, and if so, how.
And after you answer that question, so my question a little bit connected to that is, so what you personally, and how do you think that your experience in 120 and working with people from Shaharit has helped you lead this struggle for equality, for recognition, and how do you think you're advancing this mission? And if you could also reference your experience in the program, that would be helpful for audience also to understand more what you did during your time at 120. And of course, both questions are for both of you.
For both of you, sure.
Oh, would you want to start?
If you want to start, go ahead.
Okay. I think that most of the babies that are missing were born to Yemenite families. However, not all of them. There are missing babies from families from all of the Mizrahi origin families, and even some Ashkenazi. Not many, very few, but there are some. I did not research this issue, but I can tell you a story about my mother. My mom was born in an Israeli hospital a few months after my grandparents immigrated to Israel. My grandma was a 19-year-old girl. She did not speak any Hebrew at the time. She was a newcomer to Israel. And she said that the day after after she gave birth, so the nurse brought her a baby to nurse, and she looked at her and she said, "This is not my baby. This baby is not my baby." And the nurse said, "This is your baby. You don't know anything." And she said, "I started screaming, but this is not my baby. I know my baby. This is not my baby." And she started like going around in the hospital, and she found my mom in a different crate, in a different room. And she actually forced the nurse to go there. And she said to her, "This is my baby." And the nurse checked, and she said, "You're right. We had a mistake." And she gave her my mom. And the nurse was very surprised. How can, she told her, "How can that be? That you are Oleh Hadash, you're just an immigrant, and you know, and you can recognize your baby." And my grandma, she always tells this story, and she said, I told her, "Why do you speak to me like this? Even a monkey mom would identify her baby. She would know this is my child." So I think that when my grandma told me this story, and afterwards I've heard many other stories like this, that mothers, they just, you know, nurses and doctors just took the babies and said, "Your baby is, this is not your baby," or "Your baby is dead," or "Your baby is sick and you cannot see your baby." And after a few days, your baby died. So this is a very difficult story. It's very difficult for me to even talk about it. And I remember when I had a very intimate conversation with my grandma, and she said, "We couldn't believe that Jews would do it to us." Okay, they felt that they are coming to Israel to be a part of the Jewish people, and they are our brothers and sisters, and we trust them. We trust our Jewish brothers and sisters, that they would be good to us. So they were very open, they were very trusting, and after when time moved on, they understood that they should not be so trusting, and it was a big trauma for them, because they thought that we are coming to be together with our family, with our nation, with our brothers and sisters. So I think that today we know that when people say that it's not possible, that it didn't happen, you're just imagining things. It's your Eastern imagination, right? Because we imagine things that don't happen. We should remind them that things like that happened in Ireland at those years, happened in Australia. That strong community, in Australia and in Ireland, that children that were taken from their families and were given to other families. So I choose to believe the families, because they lost their children, and they, as you said, did not get any real explanation for what happened to their children. And I think that for the state of Israel to say, yes, that happened, it's a very, very big problem, not only for the people who did it, but also for the ethos of the state of Israel as being home for all Jews. And being the home for the Jewish people is really that's the reason that the state of Israel was established. So everyone would come here. But if you treat some Jews different than other Jews, then we have a problem. And saying that loudly, it's very difficult. I believe that the state of Israel is still the house and the home of all the Jewish people. And I try to think of it as problems within the family. You know, we have to solve our problems. We have to take responsibility for what happened. And we need to think how we can acknowledge the past, acknowledge what happened, and treat those wounds, treat those painful traumas and memories so we can move on to the next stage. And
or I'm wondering how you feel about what Sagit said, if you've had any experience with this issue of discrimination, if you can share some of that,
Okay.
either personal or beyond to the broader community, and answer Gabriel's question as we wrap up as well, too.
So I'm of Yemenite origin, but I was lucky enough that my family had arrived here more than 100 years ago in the beginning of the 20th century, 20, 30 years before, even more than 30 years before the State of Israel was established. So we were quite based here. So I think it's one of the reasons that my family did not. We don't have such a case, at least in the closer family. And yet, it was always clear to me that it happened. I didn't have a doubt. I faced it when I was actually in the military service, and during my military service, there was like a project in the Memorial Day of the Holocaust. As soldiers, we went to visit Holocaust survivors and give them, like, you know, like tell them thank you for for allowing for your sacrifice, etc. And I went to this project. I was an officer back then. I went there to visit a lady who had a really strange last name. Strange for me because her last name was Dadush, and Dadush is a Mizrahi last name. And I was quite surprised, you know, how come that I'm going to a Holocaust survivor and she has a Mizrahi last name? Did she get married with a Mizrahi a man? I mean, it wasn't that typical back then. What's going on? And then when I came to this really sweet old lady, she told me an amazing story about the Holocaust in North Africa, in Libya. And that was when I faced, I even, you know, I found out that there was Holocaust also in North Africa. And in addition, she told me that when she was, she later on arrived in Israel, and she gave birth and she had a baby boy, and he disappeared somehow. And with her mother instinct, she knew where to go and find him. And they told him he was dead, and she went somewhere and she found her baby boy, and she also saw Yemenite babies there. And for me, I didn't doubt for a moment. It was crystal clear for me that it happened. And you know, earlier when I talked about solidarity, I think a lot of the Israeli society doesn't demonstrate solidarity to Mizrahi Jews, Yemenite, and not only that tell these kind of stories, like the story that Sagit just told about her family, and other stories that are quite famous. We have some members at the Knesset. They told their stories recently. And I think many years the Israeli society did not demonstrate any solidarity to these stories, and the common thing to do was to deny these kind of stories, or, you know, to ignore them. And I think, you know, I really connect to what you said, Sagit, about dealing with these kind of things within the family. I understand what you say, but in order to deal with things, you first need to recognize them. And there is no recognition, there is still mostly denial. Politicians in Israel that deal with this issue, they mostly do take populist steps, and they, you know, they all they want to do is have like their headlines, and that the media will talk about it in the way they wanted to talk about it, but eventually the state of Israel has they passed a law or something like that, that the archives will be closed to 70 more years. So there is no, you know, the state of Israel continues to bury this story. And it's a problem, you know. These kind of things happen in other places in the world, as Sagit mentioned, in Australia, in Canada, in Ireland, etc. And you know, all these countries dealt with it in a very sensitive way, and they understood that first, in order to heal the wounds, you first need to recognize and talk about the pain. And in Israel, we're still very, very far from this stage of even being able to mention it and really talk about it. And it's a pity, you know, because it really affects the trust that the society, that the people have in the state and in the government.
I agree that because this is such a painful topic and something that really touches on the most sensitive places in the heart, it can cause further division and so further discord. So, and I'm curious why you think, or why you think, and then Sagit, I'll ask you the same thing, that this hasn't been dealt with as clearly and as honestly as you believe it should. What are the reasons for that?
I think Sagit explained it very well. It's really hard for the state of Israel, that is supposed to be the homeland of Jews, to admit such a thing, you know. And if we take as reference the cases in other places in the world, it was always like a hegemonic group that did such a terrible thing to another ethnic group. And here in Israel, it's a thing that an ethnic group did to the same ethnic group, you know. It's Jews to Jews. So I think it makes it harder to admit it or deal with it, and it kind of questions or doubts the essence of Israel as homeland for Jewish people. And I also want to add that we also need to one of the things that should be checked around this the disappearance of the children thing is that we need to check the involvement of foreign countries. There are doubts that that the kids were also taken to other communities, Jewish communities abroad in the United States and stuff like that. There are many. I mean, you know, it's a big issue that should be really explored, but nobody has the motivation to do it. Too many people have too much to lose. Not only people, also you know, the state.
So, ladies, I appreciate your answer on this very sensitive issue, and I know it isn't easy to talk about. So thank you. Now, moving forward, I would love to hear about your work, but what both of you are doing right now to build solidarity amongst the Mizrahim and other parts of society here within Israel and beyond. So, Sagit?
I can tell you about something that I do now. I have a new project trying to bring a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi women, students actually, high school girls, to study science and computer engineering in order to help them to take part of the high-tech industry in Israel. So this is maybe, the high-tech industry in Israel is maybe one of the strongest fortresses of the old elites in Israel, of the Ashkenazi secular families who built the country. And from the other hand, the Sephardi Haredi community is Mizrahi, it's girls, and it's ultra-Orthodox people who are not usually taking part of the economics in Israel. And if it would happen, then I think it's going to be important contribution to bringing different parts of the communities in Israel together.
And, or what about you?
I think raising awareness is the most important thing. Like I'm trying to do it in this kind of events, and when I talk to people mostly abroad, I also find it very important to talk to Palestinian people about the issue, because I found out that they are really not aware of it, and abroad it seems that Israel was established by Jews who came from Europe to a place that they don't belong to, and I think it's really important to for people to know that Israel is all that Jews have been part of the Middle East for thousands of years in a row. I do want to mention a project that I'm working on now. It's a politics school. I'm doing it with some fellow feminist partners. We're opening, so we established this politics school, and we're opening a program called 51. It's for women. It's supported by Shaharit, I need to say. And it's a training program of 12 session mentoring to women from diverse backgrounds. We're going to have Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Arab Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, secular Jews, religious, etc. We're trans women, anything. We're looking for the beautiful diversity of the Israeli population. And we're doing it because we think it's really important to have as many voices and as many female voices in the Israeli politics. As we know, we're a lack of them. Israel is really not good in representing women in the parliament and in general in the parliament, the government, etc. So we're trying to change it, and we're definitely going to bring our feminist and Mizrahi feminist agenda into this politics.
That's terrific. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how that goes, and Sagit, hearing more about the work that you're doing. Now, one feature of our Times of Israel community Zoom sessions, which is a little bit different from this, but still, adjacent, is we asked our guests what books they're reading or have read that have inspired them, encouraged them, moved them somehow in their work, in their way of seeing the world. So I'm going to throw that question to both of you. Are there any books that you would like us to be reading? Those of us who are tuning in from all over the world. We've got folks listening from the United States, from Sweden, from India, from Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, all over really, and of course here Israel, and also in Palestine as well. Are there books that you think that we need to pick up and read?
Okay, I'll start. I think one of the books that really inspired me, I'm sorry, but it's not Israeli nor Palestinian, it's American. It's called My Stroke of Insight, a brain scientist's personal journey, by Jill Bolter Taylor. She's a brain scientist and she had a stroke. and she wrote a book about her stroke and about recovering. And for me, I need to admit here that my master degree is in brain science. I'm fascinated about the human brain, and I think social change is possible because the human brain changes. So, and the human brain is dynamic, you know, and if the human brain can change, so obviously the human society can change as well. And so I highly recommend this book.
I second that. It's a terrific book. I loved it. So thank you for that recommendation. Sagit, anything that we should pick up and read?
I have two books here. I think there are many books who inspired me and I felt very connected to, but there are two books that I can say that reflect the processes, my inner world. And the first one is this book. It was written in English. The origin was written in English. It's a book wrote by Professor Tamar Ross, and it's called Expanding the Palace of Torah, Orthodoxy and Feminism. And when I read that book, I felt that, wow, someone took my thoughts and all of my inner fight between different parts of me, between being a feminist and being an Orthodox Jew, and built this beautiful construction that put everything in its place and gives me this very strong ideologic and halachic base to stand on. And I go back to this book many times because I feel that she gave answers to many questions that are part of my life. And sometimes when I feel a bit, you know, troubled or not totally into trusting myself and what I do, I go back to this book and I get so much strength out of it. And the second book is, well, it was written in Hebrew, but it is a book that was written by Harav Binyamin Lau. It's called the halachic thinking of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef was, I think, the spiritual leader of and the figure who did a great revolution in Israel. Just to make a point, there were almost 1 million people who came to his funeral in Israel. So it tells something about how important he was within the Mizrahi community. And if you can read those books, it's not easy reading. It's heavy reading, but I think it's worth it.
Thank you. Those are wonderful suggestions, and I really appreciate it. And I know that the folks listening in will appreciate it as well. And Sagit and Oram, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And we're so lucky to hear your perspectives, your insights, and your visions also for moving into the future for a more just and more equal and more balanced society for everybody. And thank you very much to Shaharit for this partnership. It's really a privilege. You know, when so much of Israel is viewed through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and yet there is just so much more happening beyond that. And while that certainly is part of the backdrop of our society, we also have so many other things happening within different communities. And it is an honor and a privilege to be highlighting some of the stories from these various communities in our series. So Thank you, everybody, and especially to our guests here. And please keep up the incredible work that you're doing. Have a good night.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Gabrielle.
Thank you.